I'm Afshin Rattansi, and welcome to Going Underground with a new look, but still unearthing the stories and perspectives buried by the powerful. Coming up on the show. Palestine is still the issue as hospitals, schools and information itself is targeted by UK, US and EU nation weaponry in Gaza. We speak to legendary filmmaker Richard Pilger about the double standards of power and the death of honest journalism from Palestine to China. All this and more coming up in today's special edition of Going Underground. Palestine is still the issue. The title of a sequel 2002 film by legendary journalist and filmmaker Richard Pilger is a sentiment seemingly unheeded by so-called mainstream media, even when the offices of NATO nation journalists are bombed by the UK, US, EU armed Israeli military. Joining me from Sydney is Richard Pilger. John, thanks so much for coming on the show. You said Palestine is the issue in the last century and in this century. How does it link everything from war and peace, atrocities, imperialism, information to neoliberalism?
Well, Palestine is the center of a great imperial act. I've made two films called Palestine is Still the Issue, 28 years apart. I may make another one. It'll be called Palestine is Still the Issue, because Palestine, unless we understand the atrocity being imposed on Palestine and the right of people to defend themselves, the right of people to resist against an external outside force, a force that it becomes more extreme by the moment, and I'm talking about Israel, then we'll never understand how the world works. There's been a whole attempt to make Hamas the central issue of the reporting, and that's nonsense, as if Hamas is a peculiar demon. In fact, Hamas and its military wing are part of a resistance that was provoked by the Israelis. The real demon in this is Israel, but it's not simply Israel. I mean, this is as much a British and American war against Palestine as it is an Israeli one. You know, just a few years ago, the chief of the defence staff in Britain, Sir Nick Carter, visited Israel, and between himself and senior Israeli strategists, they drew up basically a secret plan, a partnership, a military partnership between Israel and Britain. In fact, it goes much deeper than that. It's an integration of the two military forces, where you have Israelis being trained in ordnance design in Britain, ordnance design as bombs, and British soldiers being trained with units that have been, as the IDF describes it, as Palestinian tested. So the integration of Britain, and especially the United States, which gives Israel $10 million a day, is complete. So it is, in one sense, it's a British, European, American war against the people of Palestine, who are doing one thing, and that is exercising their moral and legal right to resist a brutal occupation.
Britain says it's a friend of Israel. You know the two-sidesism that is mandated under broadcasting restrictions, as it were, here, because obviously when you're talking about atrocities, as we know, Israel says the responsibility lies with Hamas. It is using civilians as human shields among journalists, schools and homes, and they gave fair warning. And Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary here, says the UK condemns Hamas attacks on civilians and reaffirms Israel's right to self-defense.
Well, right, fine, Afshin, you had to say that, but there are not two sides. And actually, the very notion of two sides is obscene. It's like people looking up at German bombs during the Blitz and saying, but there's two sides here. You know, the Palestinians have crude rockets, and when they're accused of indiscriminate shelling, yes, the rockets are crude. But on the other hand, Israel is doing discriminate targeting. It's deliberately attacking, as it's always done, civilian targets. And we had the spectacle the other day of a high-rise building in which the media, almost all Palestinian, certainly non-Western media, we had the spectacle of this building being blown up by the Israelis with the nonsensical story that it was harbouring Hamas. It wasn't. And all those journalists there are witnesses to that. It's like the BBC reporter, Jeremy Bowen, who talks about a war between Israel and Hamas. Bowen knows that's wrong. It's an attack on an occupied people by the occupier, Israel, backed by great powers.
Do you think these journalists, you mentioned Jeremy Bowen, the Middle East editor of the state-mandated BBC, who had to apologise previously being pro-Palestine in his reporting, do you think they understand that firing stun grenades into the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the equivalent of Christmas Eve is like doing that to the Vatican on Christmas Eve? I mean, it was Eid al-Fitr. It's a bit like that, bombing the Vatican or sending the soldiers into the Vatican?
Well, if they don't know, what are they doing out there? I mean, you don't actually have to be in the Holy Land to understand that. The provocation, the attack on Palestinians and the attack on the holiest mosque in Islam was entirely unprovoked. And the fact that, and Hamas are warned the Israelis, stop these attacks on our people in Jerusalem. Stop them now, or we will resist. And so they resisted, as every people has a right to do. The Western media, you know, where are they in Gaza? Yes, there are a lot of Palestinian journalists risking their lives, and Muslim journalists and Arabic-speaking journalists, but where are all the high-paid Western journalists? It looks to me like a boycott of Gaza.
You think there was a time when journalists were tried harder to get into Gaza? Obviously, the journalists are saying, they don't explicitly say, but it's Israel that actually prevents them and doesn't give them the passes. And I should say, Israel obviously says there were rocks at Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Israel says they give warnings, although that's disputed by some of the children who've seen their parents being killed.
Well, we know that. Israel is a lie machine and has been proven to be that. But I think we do have to understand the responsibility in Britain. It had the responsibility of not only the present government, but the Labour Party is part of that. I mean, Starmer's Labour Party, which allowed pro-Israel groups to direct the policies of the Labour Party that, in effect, support this attack. When you have the shadow foreign secretary saying that to criticise Israeli atrocities is anti-Semitic, then we're in Lewis Carroll world, really.
The BBC had a piece after some of the atrocities in the past week saying, but why is it all these protesters, we saw that some of the largest protests in the world here in London, but I know they've been all around the world, why is it they don't protest about the Syrian government or against the, according to Western sources, genocide committed by China? I know we're going to talk about China in part two. Why are these protesters about Palestine at all?
Why don't they protest against anything? Why don't they protest to the Australian government about the genocide against the Indigenous people? Why don't they protest to the US government about the dozens of countries that is overthrown and about the great numbers of people whose death it has caused and whose dispossession it has caused? It's a banal argument. People are protesting about an atrocity that is going on before our eyes, and we're allowed to see that atrocity because of some of the bravest journalists, and I know some of these people, photographers, cameramen, people whose building we saw blown up. In one of my films, The War You Don't See, there is a horrific sequence in which an Israeli sniper guns down a Palestinian cameraman who's lying wounded on the ground, and then they continue to shoot at his legs. He was then so seriously wounded he probably wouldn't walk again. I mean, that's the kind of bravery that these people, mostly Palestinians, I have to say, mostly Palestinians, the high-paid BBC people and others are just not there. Now, yes, it may be very difficult. The Israelis, whose domain they seem to cover very well, won't let them in. Why don't they get in, regardless?
There are indeed tunnels that they keep telling us about from Egypt. Congresswoman Tlaib in the United States, a Palestinian extraction, arguably fell into a trap trying to attack Hamas. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, this rising star in the Democrat Party, said that apartheid states are not democracies. Tony Blinken, someone who supported the destruction, certainly it ended up like that, of Africa's richest per capita country, Libya, said he wasn't convinced about the AP Al Jazeera building being full of Hamas operatives. Is it changing in the United States if it's not changing in London? Is
that a change? I don't know if it's a change. You know, Biden and Obama were in 2014, during the last Israeli killing fest on Palestine, they were killing something like an average of 11 children a day, and yet Obama and Biden arranged the resupply of precision weapons to Israel. Biden is now the president. I don't see any difference. The only difference, the only resistance is the resistance. That's what's different in this attack. There is a real resistance. And that should be matched by people going beyond their governments, beyond their parliaments, and going into the streets. That's the only way. Whether or not that succeeds, I don't know. But there is no other way.
You've suggested a link between those pictures of atrocities coming from Palestine and the British Army and the British state. Has Israel, I know they've been accused of killing journalists in the past, borrowed from the NATO playbook when it famously blew up Belgrade TV in Yugoslavia in this destruction of the big tower in Gaza housing media organizations?
It's a lot more dangerous now than when I was a war correspondent, particularly in Southeast Asia. Because now, your side, that is the side representing the people whose newspaper or broadcasting organization sent you, are aiming for you. You're a target. But at the very least, these Palestinian cameramen and photographers and journalists, they are targets. But all journalists now are targets. Go into St Bride's Church in London, into the corner that pays tribute to journalists who've died in covering wars, and there they are. The names are listed in the last few years that indicate the trend that the US in particular doesn't give a damn whether you're a journalist or whether you have a lanyard hanging around your neck that says journalist. You'll get shot. The Israelis, of course, not only don't give a damn, they don't even consider it. You'll get shot, period.
John, I'll stop you there. More from John Pilger after the break when we discuss double standards from China to the torture of Julian Assange.